The reflection in the looking-glass was a stranger, a ghost in white silk and Belgian lace, with eyes wide and dark as a hunted doe's. Clara's hands, hidden in the dress's expensive folds, trembled so hard the seed pearls sewn along the bodice shivered with a life of their own. The gown was a cage, beautiful and suffocating, a testament to a transaction she had no say in. Outside, the sounds of celebration, men's hearty laughter, the clink of whiskey glasses, drifted up from the parlor. They were celebrating her sale. Her father, a man whose spine had been bent not by age but by debt, had called it an arrangement, a union, a fine match. Carlton Graves was a man of considerable means, he'd said, his gaze fixed on the worn spot on the carpet, the biggest rancher in the whole of Wyoming territory. He would provide for her, protect her. Clara knew Carlton Graves. She'd seen the hard set of his jaw, the cold possessiveness in his eyes when he looked at his horses, his land, and now, her. He was twice her age, a widower whose first wife had died under circumstances whispered about but never openly discussed. They said she had simply faded, like a flower denied the sun. Clara turned from the mirror. The room, her childhood room, felt like a tomb. Her father's debt was a heavy stone, and she was the sacrifice meant to seal it shut. But the wildness that had always hummed beneath her skin, the same spirit that drove her to ride too fast and climb too high, was now screaming. It was a cornered animal, ready to tear itself free no matter the cost. That night, when the house fell into a drunken, satisfied silence, she moved. The white dress lay on the floor like a shed skin. In its place, she pulled on her sturdiest riding skirt, a woolen blouse, and her brother's old worn coat. She took no keepsakes, no sentimental trifles, only a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and the little money she had saved, coins that felt pitifully light in her palm. The air outside was sharp and clean, a slap of reality that cleared her head. She moved through the shadows to the stables, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saddled Bess, her steady mare, her hands working with a desperate efficiency she didn't know she possessed. Bess's warm breath ghosted against her cheek, a silent question. "We're running, girl," Clara whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. "We're running for our lives." She did not look back. To look back was to turn to salt, to be frozen by the sight of the life that was no longer hers. She urged Bess into a gallop, away from the manicured lawns and the looming shadow of Carlton Graves's ranch, and pointed her toward the dark, jagged teeth of the mountains. The forest swallowed them whole. Pine branches, heavy with an early snow, clawed at her face and tore at her coat. The moon was a sliver, offering little guidance. She rode on instinct, pushing Bess through frozen streams that cracked and groaned under the horse's weight, the icy water soaking the hem of her skirt and biting at her ankles. The world became a terrifying chaos of snapping twigs, the mournful hoot of an owl, and the relentless pounding of her own blood in her ears. For 2 days, she pushed onward and upward, the landscape growing more unforgiving with every mile. The bread was gone. A gnawing hunger settled deep in her belly, a cold, hard knot of fear. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that seeped through her coat, her blouse, her very skin, until her bones ached with it. On the 3rd day, the sky, which had been a clear, merciless blue, turned the color of lead. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain. She lost all sense of direction. Every tree looked the same, every snow-covered rock a new and insurmountable obstacle. Bess, ever loyal, stumbled, her breath coming in ragged, steaming bursts. Clara's own strength was failing. Her hands, numb and clumsy, could barely hold the reins. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world tilted. She slid from the saddle, a boneless heap in the deepening snow, the impact jarring the last bit of air from her lungs. Bess nudged her with her soft nose. whinnying softly, a sound of distress in the vast, silent wilderness. Clara tried to rise, but her limbs would not obey. The cold had her now. It was a heavy blanket, pulling her down into a deep, dreamless sleep. Her last coherent thought was not of Carlton or her father, but of the simple, impossible wish for a warm fire. He found her by chance, a flicker of dark color against the overwhelming white. Eli was tracking a buck, his movements economical and silent, a part of the forest itself. He'd seen the horse first, standing riderless, its head drooped, a statue of defeat. Then he saw the woman, a heap of dark wool half buried in the snow. His first instinct was to turn away. Trouble, that's all a woman out here, alone and in this state, could ever be. Town was a day's ride, and he wanted no part of it. He'd built his cabin this far into the mountains for a reason. Solitude was a balm for wounds that never fully healed. But he hesitated. He saw the fine fabric of her skirt, the small, useless boots peeking from beneath the snow. She was no mountain woman. He knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, and rolled her over. Her face was pale, tinged with blue, her lips cracked. She was young, frighteningly young. A faint puff of condensation, barely visible, escaped her lips, still alive. He swore under his breath, a low, guttural sound of frustration. His jaw tightened, the scar that ran from his temple to his chin pulling the skin taut. He had come here to escape the world of men and their endless, senseless violence. He had not come here to play savior. He looked at the sky, at the unrelenting snowfall. Leaving her was a death sentence. He knew it with a grim certainty. The hard-won peace he had carved out for himself was about to be shattered. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire past, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bird. He slung her over his shoulder with a practiced ease that bespoke a time when he had carried other burdens, heavier ones, and started the slow, arduous trek back to his cabin, the riderless mare trailing behind them like a shadow. The cabin was small, built of sturdy pine logs chinked with mud and moss. It was a shelter, not a home. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, curing leather, and something else, the faint, lingering scent of loneliness. He laid her on the cot, his own bed, a simple frame strung with rope and topped with a thin mattress stuffed with straw and a pile of furs. Her body was rigid with cold. He worked with a detached efficiency, his hands calloused and rough, moving with a purpose that belied his reluctance. He stripped off her wet boots and stockings, his touch impersonal, his gaze averted. Her feet were like blocks of ice. He pulled off her damp coat and wrapped her in the driest, warmest furs he had. He built up the fire in the stone hearth until it roared to life, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He considered his options. He could take her to town as soon as the storm broke, drop her at the sheriff's office and be done with it. She was clearly running from something, or someone. A runaway wife, most likely. The quality of her clothes suggested a husband with money, and money meant power. He wanted no part of that. His life was complicated enough. But looking at her, shivering violently even under the thick furs, a flicker of something he'd thought long dead, a sense of duty, of decency, stirred within him. He couldn't just leave her. Not yet. He tended to her wounds. There was a long, angry gash on her forehead where she must have hit a rock when she fell, and her hands were raw and scraped. He cleaned the cut with whiskey, his touch surprisingly gentle, and bandaged it with a strip of clean linen. He rubbed her frozen hands and feet, the friction bringing a painful, prickling life back to them. He did it all in silence, his expression unreadable, a mask of grim resolve. He kept his distance, both physical and emotional, a wall built of experience and pain. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented. They focused on his face, taking in the rough-hewn features, the unshaven jaw, the angry red line of the scar. Fear flickered in their depths. "Where?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "My cabin," he said, his voice as rough as his appearance. "You were near frozen. Another hour and you'd have been dead." She tried to sit up, a wave of pain and weakness washing over her. He put a hand on her shoulder, not unkindly, and pushed her gently back down. "Stay put. You're no good to anyone right now." She looked around the small, sparse cabin. A rough table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, shelves holding a few tins and sacks of flour and beans. A rifle rested against the wall near the door. It was a man's space, stark and functional. There was no softness here. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, rattling the single window pane in its frame. The world had shrunk to the 4 walls of this small cabin. They were isolated, trapped together by the fury of the wilderness. A fragile, unspoken truce settled between them, born of necessity. Over the next few days, a routine formed. He would hunt, check his traps, chop firewood. She, still weak but determined not to be a burden, would tend the fire. Try to cook what little they had, a thin stew made from salted pork and dried beans, and mend his torn shirts with a small sewing kit she found in a wooden box. She watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. He was a man who seemed more comfortable with the silence of the trees than with human company. His hands, though calloused, were capable, whether he was skinning a rabbit or carving a piece of wood. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they held a deep, profound sadness, a weariness that went far beyond his years, and the way he watched the tree line, with a constant, vigilant stillness. It was as if he expected an attack, not from a bear or a mountain lion, but from ghosts only he could see. She never asked him his name, and he never asked hers. They were 2 strangers, bound by a snowstorm, each with a past they did not wish to speak of. One evening, as the firewood pile dwindled and the wind shrieked with a renewed violence, the reality of their situation pressed in on her. She was a fugitive, and he was a stranger who had saved her life. He owed her nothing. He could still decide to send her back. "I'll be quiet," she said, her voice small but clear in the firelit cabin. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his expression guarded. "I won't cause you any trouble. I just need to stay. For a little while." He stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers. He saw the desperation there, the raw fear she tried so hard to conceal. Something in her plea, in its simple, honest humility, touched a place in him he had thought long dead and buried. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and turned back to his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone the only answer she received. But it was enough. He didn't show it, but her words had moved him. He wouldn't send her away, not into the storm. That night, the cold was a living thing in the cabin. The fire, fed with the last of the dry wood, burned low, offering little comfort against the deep, penetrating chill. Clara, wrapped in every fur and blanket he owned, couldn't stop shivering. Sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were a chaotic torrent of fragmented memories. The cold calculation in Carlton Graves's eyes, her father's averted gaze, the terrifying darkness of the forest. She saw herself in the white dress, running, always running, with the sound of hoofbeats thundering behind her. She awoke with a strangled cry, her body slick with a cold sweat despite the freezing air. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her icy skin. The nightmare clung to her, a suffocating shroud. She felt a presence beside the cot. Eli was kneeling there, a dark silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He said nothing, simply watched her, his face lost in the shadows. The silence stretched, broken only by her ragged sobs. Then he reached out. His hand, large and rough, came to rest on her forehead. With a surprising gentleness, he brushed the damp strands of hair away from her face. His fingers were warm against her cold skin. a steady, solid anchor in the terrifying darkness. His touch was hesitant, almost uncertain, as if it were a gesture he had not made in a very long time. It was meant to be a simple act of comfort, a fleeting moment of reassurance. But his hand lingered, for a beat longer than it should have. His calloused thumb stroked her temple, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a touch that spoke of a shared loneliness, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both carried. In the quiet dark of the snowbound cabin, a line had been crossed, a fragile connection forged in the space between a nightmare and the dawn. He finally pulled his hand away, but the warmth of his touch remained, a phantom heat against her skin. The morning after her nightmare, a quiet shame settled over Clara. She felt exposed, her terror laid bare before this silent, watchful man. But Eli made no mention of the night before. He moved about the cabin with his usual economy of motion, his face giving nothing away. The moment his hand had lingered on her skin might have been a dream, a figment of her fevered imagination, but the memory of it was a small, warm coal she held tight within her. As the days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun often obscured by heavy, gray clouds, the cabin became her entire world. The fierce independence that had driven her into the wilderness now channeled itself into survival. She refused to be a fragile burden. She learned the heft and balance of the axe, her small frame straining as she helped him split kindling from the logs he hauled in. Her hands, once accustomed to embroidery needles and piano keys, became chapped and calloused, marked by blisters that broke and healed. She learned to cook over the open hearth, turning their meager rations of flour, salt pork, and the occasional rabbit he managed to trap into something that resembled a meal. She mended his worn flannel shirts, her stitches small and neat, a piece of her old life brought into this new, raw existence. Eli watched her, his gaze often resting on her when he thought she wasn't looking. He saw the grim determination in her face as she scrubbed the single pot they owned with sand from a bucket. He saw the way she never complained about the gnawing cold, or the perpetual hunger, or the hard, rough life he had chosen for himself and thrust upon her. He had expected tears, pleas to be taken to town, the delicate crumbling of a woman unsuited for this world. Instead, he saw a resilience that mirrored the tough, wiry pines that clung to the mountainside, bending in the wind but never breaking. A grudging respect took root in him, a foreign and unsettling feeling. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara's fear of him began to recede, replaced by a tentative trust. It was a trust built not on words, for they spoke little, but on actions. It was in the way he always left the warmest spot by the fire for her. It was in the steady, reassuring presence of him sleeping on a bed of furs on the floor, a silent guardian between her and the howling emptiness outside. She began to trust his silence, realizing it was not a sign of anger or disapproval, but a deep-seated habit of a man who had learned that words were often useless, or worse, dangerous. She grew accustomed to his scars. The angry red line that bisected his eyebrow and cut a path down his cheek was no longer a mark of menace, but a part of him, a map of a pain she could not comprehend. She found herself wondering about the man he had been before the scar, before the haunted look had settled deep in his eyes. She still saw the way he watched the trees, his body held in a state of perpetual readiness, as if the forest itself were an old enemy that might, at any moment, rise up and attack. It was the posture of a soldier who had never truly left the battlefield. One morning, the snow fell in thick, wet flakes, muffling the world in a profound silence. They sat by the fire, the air in the cabin still and close, emboldened by the quiet intimacy of the moment. She finally voiced the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. "Were you in the war?" she asked, her voice soft. The change in him was instantaneous and startling. His entire body went rigid, the muscles in his jaw bunching into hard knots. The warmth that had briefly settled in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a glacial coldness. He set down the piece of wood he had been carving with a sharp, final click. Without a word, he stood, pulled on his heavy coat, and walked out into the storm, shutting the door firmly behind him. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. The silence he left behind was heavy and accusing. She had trespassed, crossed an invisible line into a territory of pain he kept fiercely guarded. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold seeping back into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He was gone for hours. Clara watched the door, her stomach twisting with a mixture of regret and anxiety. The snow was falling harder now, and the thought of him out there, alone in the blizzard, was a terrifying one. When he finally returned, he was covered in a thick layer of white, a walking specter of snow and ice. He brushed himself off without looking at her and went to hang his coat by the fire. For a long time, he just stood there, his back to her, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, rough with an emotion he could not hide. "I'm sorry," he said, still not turning around, "for walking out like that." "You don't have to," she began, but he cut her off. "I did things," he said, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. "I saw things. I did things that I can't tell you. I can't tell anyone." The finality in his tone closed the subject, but his apology, his raw, unguarded admission of a pain too deep to name, was more intimate than any conversation they had ever had. She understood then that his silence was not a wall to keep her out, but a cage to keep his own demons in. After that day, the air between them shifted. A fragile, unspoken understanding had been forged. They began to share small pieces of themselves, like wary traders exchanging precious goods. She told him of her childhood in Ohio, of learning to ride on a fat pony named Patches, of her mother who had loved flowers and died too young. He, in turn, spoke of growing up on a small farm in the mountains of Tennessee, of a father who could name every bird by its song, and a brother who had taught him how to track. They spoke of dreams they once had, her dream of being a schoolteacher, his of owning a small piece of land where he could raise horses. These were ghosts of former selves, of lives that had been derailed by debt and by war. But in the telling, these ghosts felt for a moment real again. A tender, fragile bond began to form between them, a delicate thread woven in the firelit darkness, and both were acutely, terrifyingly aware of its danger. One afternoon, while Eli was out checking the snares, Clara busied herself with tidying the small cabin, tucked away on a high shelf beneath a spare woolen blanket. She found a leather-bound journal. It was old, the cover worn smooth with handling. Hesitantly, she opened it. It was not filled with words, but with sketches, drawn with a sure and steady hand in charcoal. The pages were filled with the images of war, gaunt-faced soldiers staring into the middle distance, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and horror. Horses, their bodies contorted in the agony of battle. A burning farmhouse, the flames rendered with a frantic, terrible energy. She turned the pages slowly, a profound sadness settling over her. This was the world that haunted him, the source of the shadows in his eyes. And then she saw her. Tucked in the last few pages of the book were sketches of a young woman. She had a heart-shaped face, a cascade of dark hair, and a smile that seemed to light up the page. In one drawing, she was braiding her hair. In another, she was laughing, her head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. It was a face full of life, a stark contrast to the death and destruction that filled the rest of the journal. Clara felt a sharp, unexpected pang of jealousy, followed by a wave of guilt. This was his past. This was the woman who had lived in his heart before the war had burned everything away. She closed the journal gently and put it back exactly where she had found it. The image of the smiling woman seared into her mind. When Eli returned, he knew she had found it. He didn't ask, but he saw it in the way her eyes were shadowed with a new kind of sorrow, a new understanding. She asked no questions, and he offered no explanations. But the knowledge of the journal, of the woman in its pages, now sat between them, another unspoken truth in the quiet cabin. A week later, a new storm descended, more ferocious than any that had come before. It was a true blizzard, a howling white fury that erased the world. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the snow piled in great drifts against the door and the single window. For 2 days, they were trapped, prisoners in their small wooden box. The firewood dwindled at an alarming rate, and the cabin grew colder and colder. The fire a small, defiant flicker against the overwhelming power of the storm. On the second night, the cold was unbearable. It was a physical presence, a predator that had breached their defenses and was now closing in. Huddled by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they possessed, Clara could not stop shaking. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and her body was racked with violent shivers. Eli, who had been sitting on the other side of the hearth, a stoic statue of endurance, watched her, his face etched with concern. Finally, he moved. He came to her side and sat down, his back against the rough stone of the fireplace. He hesitated for only a moment, then opened his arms. It was not a proposition, but a simple, practical offering of warmth. She crawled into his embrace without a second thought, pressing her cold body against his. He was solid and warm, a bastion against the storm. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling the furs and blankets tightly over them both, creating a small cocoon of shared heat. Her head rested against his chest, and she could hear the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the most comforting sound she had ever heard. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind rage outside. Clara's shivering slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, thawing warmth that spread through her limbs. She was acutely aware of every point of contact between them, the solid wall of his chest, the strength in the arms that held her, the rough texture of his shirt beneath her cheek. It was an intimacy born of desperation, but it was no less profound for it. The longing for simple human contact, a need she hadn't even realized she possessed, rose up in her, sharp and overwhelming. She felt him begin to shift, to loosen his hold, perhaps thinking she was warm enough now, perhaps suddenly aware of the impropriety of their position. Panic flared in her chest. She couldn't bear for him to move away, to return to his side of the fire, to reinstate the careful distance they had always maintained. "You don't have to stop," she whispered, the words barely audible over the howl of the wind, her voice trembling. "Holding me." He went still. The air between them crackled with an unspoken charge, a sudden, raw current of emotion. It was a moment stripped bare of all pretense, a collision of two lonely, wounded souls. The warmth she felt was no longer just about the cold. It was about longing and comfort and a desperate, aching need to not be alone. He didn't reply, but his arms tightened around her, pulling her even closer until there was no space left between them. He held her with a fierce, protective tenderness that spoke more than words ever could. And there, in the heart of the blizzard, held tight in the arms of a scarred and silent stranger, Clara felt safer than she had in her entire life. Nothing more happened. There was no kiss, no further intimacy. There was only the profound, unspoken truth of being held. The next morning, the storm had broken. The world outside was a pristine, blinding expanse of white, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The silence was absolute, as if the world were holding its breath. Eli went out early to check the rabbit traps he'd set at the edge of the woods before the blizzard hit. He had little hope. The snares were most likely buried under feet of snow. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him go, the sunlight glinting off the snow making her squint. A few minutes later, she heard a shout. It wasn't a cry of alarm, but something else. She saw him returning, walking with a new lightness in his step. He was holding up a rabbit by its hind legs. "Well, I'll be," he said as he approached, a slow smile spreading across his face. transforming his harsh features. "Looks like our luck's finally turned." A bubble of pure, unadulterated joy rose up in Clara's chest. It was such a small thing, a single rabbit, but after weeks of cold and hunger and fear, it felt like a miracle. A genuine, unrestrained laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure relief. Eli's smile widened, and he let out a short, rough bark of a laugh in response. It was a rusty sound, as if it hadn't been used in years, but it was real. Their laughter mingled in the crisp, cold air, a startling, beautiful sound in the vast, silent wilderness. It was the first time either of them had truly laughed in weeks, perhaps months, perhaps years, and in that shared moment of simple, unexpected joy, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. While a fragile peace settled in the snowbound cabin, a storm of a different kind was brewing in the town of Redemption. Carlton Graves stood before the sheriff, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. His wedding day had turned into a public humiliation. The bride, the pretty little thing he had purchased with her father's debt, had vanished. For the first few days, he had allowed the pretense that she had simply taken ill, a sudden fever. But the discovery of her missing mare and the damning emptiness of her room had shattered that illusion. She had run. "She's a flighty girl, Carlton," Sheriff Miller said, leaning back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "Probably got cold feet. She'll turn up in a day or two, once she's hungry and half frozen." "I am not a patient man, Miller," Graves said, his voice low and cold. He placed a heavy leather pouch on the sheriff's desk. The clink of coins was obscene in the quiet office. $500 for her return, and I don't much care what condition she's in when you find her. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly at the sum. It was more than a man could make in a year. "Dead or alive, you mean?" Graves's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "I mean, I want what is mine. She is my property. By contract and by right, I want her back." He turned and walked to the door, his polished boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. "I'm also hiring my own men who understand the value of expediency." Within hours, posters were nailed to every available surface in Redemption and the surrounding settlements. They described Clara not as a missing person, but as a runaway, almost like an escaped horse or stray cattle. A reward was offered, handsome enough to turn decent men into hunters and hunters into wolves. Graves's hired men, rough characters with cold eyes and guns worn low on their hips, fanned out from the town, their questions sharp and their presence a threat. The search had begun. Unaware of the net being cast for her, Clara found a semblance of contentment in the small cabin. The laughter they had shared over the rabbit had broken something open between them, allowing a quiet, domestic intimacy to seep into the spaces once filled with silence and mistrust. The days grew longer, the sun stronger, and the snow began a slow, grudging retreat from the forest floor, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. She had found a new purpose in caring for their small shelter, and for the man who inhabited it. One of her self-appointed tasks was mending his clothes, which were in a state of advanced decay. She worked on his last good shirt, her needle flashing in the firelight, the simple act of pulling thread through worn flannel a soothing, rhythmic meditation. Eli sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes a familiar counterpoint to the soft whisper of her sewing. The needle, slick with use, slipped, and the sharp point plunged deep into the fleshy part of her thumb. She gasped, a small, sharp intake of breath, and dropped the shirt into her lap. A perfect, ruby-red bead of blood welled up from the tiny wound. Before she could even bring the thumb to her mouth, Eli was there. He moved with a startling speed and silence, crossing the small space between them in a single stride. He knelt before her and took her hand in his fingers, calloused and strong, closed over hers, engulfing her smaller hand completely. His touch was firm, possessive, yet exquisitely gentle. "Let me see," he said, his voice a low rumble. He held her hand up to the light, his gaze fixed on the small, insignificant wound. He used his own thumb to wipe away the single drop of blood, his touch sending a jolt of heat straight up her arm. Their eyes locked over her captured hand. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, the air thick and charged. She saw a raw vulnerability in his stormy gray eyes, a flicker of an emotion she couldn't name but felt deep in her own soul. It was a look of profound, aching loneliness, of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to touch and be touched with simple tenderness. He held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, his thumb stroking the back of her skin, a silent, searching gesture. Then, as if suddenly remembering himself, he released her and stood up abruptly, turning his back to her and returning to his rifle. The moment was broken, but the echo of it remained, a palpable, humming energy in the quiet room. That evening, the memory of his touch emboldened her. As they ate their meager supper of rabbit stew, she looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a rescuer or a stranger, but a man carrying a world of sorrow. The image of the smiling woman from his journal rose in her mind. "Eli," she began, using his name for the first time. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "The woman in your journal, the one you sketched, she was beautiful." He flinched, the name a key turning in a lock he had hoped would remain forever rusted shut. He put his spoon down, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He stared into the fire, his jaw working, the scar on his face a stark white line against his skin. She thought for a moment he would get up and leave again, retreating into the cold solitude of the forest. She held her breath, regretting her intrusion, her clumsy attempt to breach his walls. But he stayed. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out, a ghost of its usual self. Her name was Anna. He said the name as if it were a prayer or a curse. "We were to be married," he continued, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. "We grew up together. I couldn't imagine a life that she wasn't in." He paused, swallowing hard. "The war came. I went to fight for the Union. I thought I was doing something right, something honorable. I was a fool." His hands clenched into fists on the rough-hewn table. "My last year, the fighting came to our valley. A Union raid. They said they were looking for sympathizers, for supplies, but they were just boys, drunk on power and fear. They were burning everything. They set fire to the barn next to her family's house." His voice broke, the sound a raw, tearing agony. "The fire spread. She was trapped inside. I was miles away, fighting for the same men, the same cause that killed her." He fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. "I never forgave myself," he whispered, the words ragged, "for not being there, for believing in anything that could lead to that. When the war was over, there was nothing left for me. Not there, not anywhere. So I came here, where the silence is loud enough to drown out the memories." Most days, tears streamed down Clara's face, silent tears of empathy for this broken man and the ghost he carried. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his clenched fist. He didn't pull away. His fingers slowly uncurled, and he turned his hand over, his rough palm meeting hers. They sat like that for a long time, their hands clasped, two solitary souls finding a fragile anchor in each other's pain. The last wall between them had finally, irrevocably, crumbled. Days later, a late spring storm blew in, a final, violent gasp of winter. It was a tempest of freezing rain and sleet that turned the forest into a treacherous landscape of ice and mud. The woodpile was dangerously low, and Eli had gone out in the worst of it, determined to gather enough to see them through. Clara watched from the window, her heart a tight knot of worry, as he disappeared into the maelstrom. He was gone for what felt like an eternity, when he finally returned. The door burst open on a gust of wind and rain, and he staggered in, his arms laden with firewood. Clara rushed to help him, taking the wood and closing the door against the storm's fury. She turned back to him and her breath caught in her throat. He was soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his chin. His hands were shaking, not from exertion, but from the bone-deep, violent chill of the freezing rain. He looked utterly exhausted, beaten down by the elements. A fierce, protective instinct rose in her, so powerful it startled her. She took his trembling hands in hers, chafing them, trying to bring some warmth back into them. "You're frozen," she said, her voice thick with concern. He looked down at her, his stormy eyes dark with a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and something else, something deeper and more intense. He saw the genuine fear for him in her face, the raw, unguarded tenderness, and in that moment, the careful control he had maintained for so long, the dam he had built around his heart, finally broke. She saw the shift in his eyes, the surrender. It was a terrifying and exhilarating sight. He was no longer looking at her as a burden or a responsibility, but as a woman. Her own heart began to hammer against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. The air was electric, charged with all the unspoken words, the shared grief, the desperate, lonely nights. "Just don't stop," she whispered, the words a plea, a permission, a command. She wasn't sure what she was asking him not to stop doing, caring, protecting her, looking at her in that way that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. He didn't need any more encouragement. He took a step forward, backing her against the rough wood of the doorframe. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss born of desperation and starvation, a raw, hungry collision. It was the taste of the storm, of rain and cold and the wildness of the woods. It was filled with the ghosts of their pasts, with Anna's memory and Carlton's shadow, a frantic, desperate attempt to burn away the pain and find solace in the living, breathing warmth of another human being. He pressed her against the door, his body a shield against the world, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her jaw. She clung to him, her fingers tangling in his wet hair, answering his hunger with her own. The kiss was long and deep, a torrent of pent-up emotion finally unleashed, but it went no further. He pulled back slowly, resting his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in ragged gasps. They were no longer strangers. They were not rescuer and victim. In the crucible of that kiss, they had been forged into something new, something undefined and dangerous. In the days that followed, a new tension settled between them, a constant, humming awareness. Clara found herself caught in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The memory of Eli's kiss was a brand on her lips, a source of both profound comfort and sharp guilt. She had fled one man only to find herself irrevocably drawn to another. Fear for the future warred with the fragile hope that was beginning to bloom in her heart. Eli sensed her turmoil. He saw the way she would sometimes stare into the distance, her expression clouded with worry. He knew she was holding something back, a final piece of her story she had not shared. One evening, as she stood by the window, staring out at the darkening ridge, he came to stand behind her. "He's the reason you're holding back, isn't he?" he asked quietly. "The man you were running from." She didn't turn. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I ran from him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But he won't let me go. He's not a man who lets go of what he thinks he owns." A cold, hard anger settled in Eli's chest. He placed his hands on her shoulders, turning her to face him. "He won't find you, and if he does, he'll have to come through me." He spoke the words with a grim finality, a vow made in the dim light of the cabin. "I'll keep you safe, Clara, I swear it." That night, for the first time, he did not make his bed on the floor. He laid his furs down beside the cot, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. They slept beside each other, separated by a few inches of space, but no longer by fear or mistrust. The darkness of the cabin was no longer menacing. It was a sanctuary. A few days later, Eli was skinning a deer he had brought down near the creek when he froze. His head snapped up, his body going utterly still, every sense on high alert. He was watching the high ridge that overlooked the valley where his cabin was nestled. Clara, who was salting the strips of meat, followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but trees and rock. Then she saw it, a dark shape, moving slowly along the crest of the ridge, a man on horseback. He was too far away to make out any details, but his presence was a violation, an intrusion into their secluded world. He sat there for a long time, a silent, ominous silhouette against the pale afternoon sky, before finally turning his horse and disappearing over the other side. Eli's face was grim, his eyes hard as flint. It could be a lost trapper, a wandering prospector, but he didn't believe in coincidence. Trouble was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he could feel a change in the weather. The rider was a scout, a harbinger. Their sanctuary had been discovered. He looked at Clara, at the fear that was beginning to dawn in her eyes, and his resolve hardened. They couldn't stay here. He began, in his mind, to plan a way out. The quiet peace they had so carefully built was about to be shattered. The sight of the lone rider on the ridge shattered their fragile peace. The world, which had shrunk to the warm, safe confines of the cabin and the surrounding woods, suddenly expanded to include the threat of pursuit, of Carlton Graves and his cold, possessive fury. The easy rhythm they had found was replaced by a quiet, grim urgency. The soldier in Eli, long dormant, awoke. Every action became deliberate, calculated for survival. "We have to move," he said that evening, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones, but she nodded, her own resolve hardening. She would not be the trembling, helpless creature he had found in the snow. She had survived the wilderness. She would survive this. Their days became a blur of focused preparation. They worked from dawn until dusk, speaking little, their movements synchronized in a silent dance of purpose. Eli taught her how to smoke the deer meat in long, thin strips that would last for weeks, how to pack it tightly with rendered fat to keep it from spoiling. They filled canvas sacks with flour, beans, and salt. Every item was weighed and considered. What was essential? What could be left behind? They were erasing their existence, preparing to become ghosts in the mountains. But Eli knew that stocking food was not enough. The true threat was not starvation, but the men who would be hunting them. He needed her to be more than a companion. He needed her to be a partner. Another set of eyes and ears, another line of defense. One afternoon, he took his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He led her to a small clearing a short distance from the cabin. The air was still, the sunlight filtering through the new green leaves of the aspens. He held the rifle out to her. "You need to learn how to use this," he said. Clara looked at the long, heavy weapon. It was an object of violence, a tool for ending life. She had never held a gun before. The thought of it repulsed her. "I can't," she whispered. "You have to," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "I can't always be with you. If they find you alone, you need to be able to protect yourself. Hope isn't a weapon." "Clara, this is—" She took the rifle hesitantly. It was heavier than she imagined, cold and impersonal. Her hands trembled as she tried to hold it steady. Eli moved behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. He placed his hands over hers, guiding them, showing her how to cradle the stock, how to fit it snugly against her shoulder. His body was pressed against hers, his chest to her back, his arm alongside hers. He smelled of pine smoke and leather, a scent that was now as familiar and comforting to her as the air she breathed. "Just breathe," he murmured, his voice low in her ear. "Don't fight it. Feel its weight. Make it a part of you." He pointed to a dead, stripped pine tree about 50 yards away. "That's your target. Line up the sight. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She closed one eye, peering down the long barrel. The small metal sight wavered, dancing with the frantic beat of her heart. She took a deep breath. Just as he said, and the sight steadied. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a deafening roar that ripped through the quiet forest. The rifle kicked back with a brutal force, slamming into her shoulder and sending a jarring shock through her entire body. She cried out, stumbling backward, and would have fallen if Eli hadn't been there to catch her. The shot went wide, splintering the bark of a tree far to the left of her target. Tears of frustration and shock welled in her eyes. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he said, his hand still firm on her arms. He turned her to face him, his stormy eyes searching hers. "Fear is good. It keeps you alive, but you can't let it rule you. Try again." She did, again and again. She loaded the rifle, settled it against her bruised shoulder, and fired. With each shot, the fear lessened, replaced by a grim determination. She learned to anticipate the kick, to control her breathing, to hold the rifle steady. Finally, a shot struck the dead pine with a satisfying thud, sending a chunk of weathered wood flying. A small, fierce surge of triumph went through her. Eli's lessons went beyond the rifle. He taught her to listen, to truly listen, to the language of the forest. A jay's scolding cry can mean a predator is near, man or animal, he told her, his voice a low murmur as they walked. The snap of a twig. You need to know if it was made by a squirrel or by a man's boot. He taught her how to walk without a sound, how to read tracks in the dirt, how to use the wind and the sun to her advantage. He was giving her his knowledge, the hard-won wisdom of a survivor. He was arming her soul as well as her hands. In the midst of this tense preparation, their relationship deepened, growing with a desperate, passionate intensity. The threat of being torn apart made every moment together precious, every touch a memory to be hoarded against a future that might not exist. They were living on borrowed time, and they both knew it. One evening, after a long day of training and packing, Eli led her to a place she had never seen before. Tucked away in a secluded grove of ancient cedars was a small, hidden pool, fed by a natural hot spring. Steam rose from the surface of the water in ghostly tendrils, mingling with the cool evening air. The place felt sacred, a secret sanctuary hidden from the world. "I thought you might want to," he began, his voice trailing off, a rare awkwardness in his manner. "To wash, properly." Clara looked at the steaming water, then at him. His face, in the soft twilight, was unguarded. The harsh lines softened. She saw the question in his eyes, the unspoken invitation. This was more than just a bath. It was an offering. She gave him a small, shy smile and began to unbutton her worn dress. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned, giving her his back, a gesture of respect that touched her more deeply than any caress. She shed her clothes, the rough fabric falling away, and stepped into the water. The heat was a blissful shock, a liquid embrace that seeped into her tired muscles, her aching bones, washing away the grime and the fear. She soaked for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Eli, you don't have to stand over there." He turned slowly. She was submerged to her shoulders, her hair fanning out around her in the water, her face and neck luminescent in the fading light. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He stripped off his own clothes and slipped into the water, the ripples from his entry gently rocking her. He kept a respectful distance, the steam creating a soft, hazy veil between them. But in the close confines of the small pool, his presence was overwhelming. She could feel the heat of his body in the water, see the powerful lines of his shoulders, the intricate map of scars that covered his back and chest. They were marks of a life lived in violence, a life she was only just beginning to understand, A profound sadness and a fierce, protective love welled up in her. This man, this broken, gentle man, had saved her in every way a person could be saved. He had healed her body, quieted her fears, and awakened a part of her soul she never knew existed. And now, they might lose it all. The thought was unbearable. She couldn't bear to think of Carlton Graves, of the future, of the coming fight. She wanted only this moment, this man. She moved toward him through the water, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped in front of him, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. She lifted a hand from the water and gently traced the line of the scar on his face, her fingers trembling slightly. "I want to forget everything," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so powerful it threatened to choke her. "Everything except your hands." It was all the invitation he needed. He pulled her against him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was achingly slow and exquisitely tender. It was not like their first frantic, desperate kiss. This was a kiss of reverence, of discovery. His hands moved from her face, down her neck, over her shoulders, learning the shape of her as if she were a new and uncharted land. Their lovemaking was as slow and sacred as a prayer. It was a silent conversation between two people who had been starved for warmth, for tenderness, for the simple, profound solace of another's touch. It was two broken souls clinging to each other, finding in their shared vulnerability a strength they did not possess alone, in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, under a canopy of stars. They created a fleeting, perfect world of their own, a defiant act of love against the cruel indifference of the universe. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the warm water, the steam rising around them like a shroud. Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I never expected to feel anything again," Eli admitted, his voice a low, rough whisper in the darkness. "After the war, after Anna, I thought that part of me was dead and buried. I thought I was—" Clara lifted her head and looked at him, her heart aching with the depth of her love for him. She pressed a soft kiss to his lips. "Then don't stop," she whispered, her voice fierce and certain. "Don't stop feeling, even if it ends." Their joy was a fragile, beautiful thing, and it was destined to be short-lived. They returned to the cabin late that night, their bodies tired but their souls alight, wrapped in the warm afterglow of their intimacy. They were 100 yards away when Eli suddenly stopped, pulling Clara behind a thicket of pines. He put a finger to his lips, his body instantly alert, every sense straining into the darkness. And then she smelled it, a faint, acrid scent on the night air. Wood smoke, but it was not the familiar, comforting smell of their own hearth. This was the smell of something burning that shouldn't be. They moved forward cautiously, their footsteps silent on the pine-needle floor of the forest. As they crested the last small rise, a gasp of pure horror escaped Clara's lips. Where their cabin should have been, there was a roaring inferno. Flames licked at the night sky, a furious, hungry orange against the blackness. The home they had built, the sanctuary that had saved her life, was being consumed, turned to ash and smoke. Graves's men had been there. Eli's face was a mask of cold, hard fury. He pulled her back, further into the shadows of the woods, his grip on her arm like iron. They could do nothing but watch as the roof caved in with a great, whooshing roar, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. Their world was burning down. When the flames finally began to die down, leaving a glowing, skeletal ruin, a wave of utter devastation washed over Clara. She began to shake uncontrollably, her body racked with violent sobs. "It's my fault," she choked out, the words torn from her. "It's all my fault. They found us because of me. I've destroyed you." Eli pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as her grief poured out of her. "No," he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble against her ear. "This is not your fault. This is his. This is the work of a man who thinks he can own a person's soul. He's wrong. They couldn't risk staying so close. He led her away from the smoldering ruins of their life, deeper into the woods, to a place he knew. It was a shallow cave, little more than an overhang of rock, but it was shelter. He had stashed a spare blanket and a few supplies there weeks ago, a soldier's precaution against the unexpected. He built a small, smokeless fire deep in the back of the cave and wrapped the single blanket around her shoulders. He sat beside her, the rifle across his lap, and held her as she shivered, her tears slowly subsiding into a bleak, exhausted silence. They huddled together through the long, cold night, with nothing left but each other, a blanket and a rifle. As the first pale light of dawn crept into the sky, illuminating the grim reality of their situation, a new, hard resolve began to form in Clara. She had spent months hiding, surviving, but survival was no longer enough. Eli was staring out at the wilderness, his face grim, already planning their next move, their next hiding place, deeper and higher into the mountains. "We can't keep running," Clara said, her voice quiet but steady. He looked at her, surprised by the strength in her tone. "They'll be hunting us now for sure. Running is all we can do." "No," she said, and she met his gaze, her eyes clear and determined. "If we run forever, I'm still in his mind, in my mind, a piece of property that has just gotten loose. And I'm not—" She took a deep breath, the cold morning air filling her lungs. "We have to go back, to redemption. We have to face him." Eli stared at her, a protest already forming on his lips. To go back to town was suicide. It was walking directly into the lion's den. But then he saw the look on her face. This was not the frightened girl he had rescued from the snow. This was a woman, forged in the fire of hardship and love, who was now claiming her own freedom, not just from a man, but from fear itself. "If we run forever," she repeated, her voice ringing with a conviction that stunned him. "He wins. I won't let him win." The journey back to redemption was a descent from a harsh paradise into a familiar hell. They traveled by night, sticking to the shadows, moving through the landscape like fugitives. The moon was a slender, unforgiving sickle in the sky, offering little light and no comfort. For Eli, the return was a torment. Every step toward the town was a step back into a world he had fought to escape, a world of men and their cruelties. For Clara, it was a grim pilgrimage, a necessary march toward a confrontation she had both dreaded and, now, desperately needed. They arrived on the outskirts of town in the dead of night, the witching hour when even the saloons had fallen into a drunken stupor. The air, thick with the smell of coal smoke and manure, was a suffocating contrast to the clean, sharp scent of the mountains. Eli led her through a labyrinth of dark alleys, his hand never straying far from the butt of the Colt revolver tucked into his belt. His body was a study in taut, coiled tension, every shadow a potential threat, every distant sound a warning. He stopped before a large, dark building that she recognized as the livery and blacksmith's forge. A faint, rhythmic clanging came from within, even at this late hour. Eli knocked a specific pattern on a small side door. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a man stood silhouetted against the forge's ruddy glow. He was broad-shouldered, with a kind, weathered face and dark, intelligent eyes. "Eli," the man said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief and concern. "My God, I heard you were dead." "Not yet, Miguel," Eli replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I need a place to lie low, and a favor." Miguel's eyes flickered to Clara, who stood half-hidden in the shadows behind Eli. He took in her worn clothes, the fear and exhaustion in her eyes, and seemed to understand everything in an instant. He opened the door wider. "Get in, both of you." He led them to a small, clean room in the loft above the stables, the air sweet with the smell of hay. He brought them a plate of cold beef and bread, and a pitcher of water. It was the first real meal they had eaten in days. Miguel asked no questions, a sign of a deep and abiding friendship that transcended words. He simply said, "You are safe here. No one will find you. Rest." The next day, while Eli slept a dead, dreamless sleep for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara knew what she had to do. With a knot of dread in her stomach, she slipped out of the livery and made her way to the small house where she had grown up. She found her father in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face etched with new lines of worry. He looked 10 years older than when she had last seen him. He started when he saw her, a mixture of relief and terror on his face. "Clara, where have you been? Are you all right?" "I am fine, Father," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "You must come home," he pleaded, his voice a desperate whisper. He rushed to the window, peering out as if expecting Graves' men to appear at any moment. "Carlton is a patient man, but his patience has run out. He will ruin us. He will destroy everything we have left." "He will destroy nothing if I am not here to be his prize," she replied, her voice cold. "Do not be a fool, child," he hissed, turning on her. "This is not a game. He has men out looking for you. And what of this man they say you are with? This scarred half-ghost from the mountains? Do you think he can protect you from Carlton Graves? Graves will have him killed. He will see him hanging from a tree for daring to touch what is his." The venom in his words, the casual dismissal of Eli's life, ignited a cold fire in Clara's chest. "He is a better man than you will ever be," she said, her voice shaking with a quiet rage. "He saved my life, and I am not a piece of property. Father, I am not yours to sell." Her father stared at her, his face ashen. He saw not the dutiful daughter he had raised, but a stranger, a woman with a will of iron he did not recognize. He sagged into his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a pathetic, whimpering fear. "He will ruin me," he whispered again, into his glass. Clara looked at the broken man before her, and felt not anger, but a profound and sorrowful pity. She turned and walked out of the house, leaving her old life behind for the second and final time. News of her return spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. The runaway bride was back, and she had not come back alone. She was with Eli, the man who had been a local hero once, a decorated Union soldier who had returned from the war a silent, broken shell of his former self, disappearing into the mountains years ago, presumed dead by most. Their story became the currency of the town, traded in whispers in the general store, in loud, jeering speculation in the saloons, in quiet, scandalized murmurs behind the lace curtains of the town's respectable homes. They could not stay hidden in the loft forever. When they finally walked out into the main street of Redemption, the town turned on them. It was a slow, creeping violence, a death by 1,000 cuts. The whispers followed them, a constant, sibilant rustle just behind their shoulders. "That's her, the one who ran out on Carlton Graves. Look at the state of her, living in the woods like an animal." The women were the cruelest. They would cross the street to avoid walking on the same boardwalk as Clara, pulling their skirts aside as if she were a contagion. They looked at her with a mixture of scorn and a strange, prurient curiosity, their eyes dissecting her, judging her. The men were more direct. They stared openly at Eli, their gazes lingering on his scarred face. Some laughed, mocking him. One man, emboldened by drink, spat on the dusty ground near Eli's feet. Eli's hand twitched toward his gun, but he held himself still, his face an unreadable mask of stone, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Clara felt the heat of 1,000 shames, but she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked on, drawing a strange, defiant strength from Eli's stoic presence beside her. The inevitable confrontation happened 2 days later. They were in the general store, buying flour and coffee, when the doors swung open and Carlton Graves walked in. He was flanked by 2 of his hired men, large, grim-faced individuals who looked more like wolves than men. The store fell silent. Graves was impeccably dressed, his suit clean, his boots polished to a high shine. He looked at Clara, his eyes sweeping over her worn dress with a look of profound distaste. Then his gaze settled on Eli, and a slow, contemptuous smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Graves said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr that was more menacing than any shout. "The lost lamb has returned to the fold, and she's brought a stray dog with her." Eli stepped slightly in front of Clara, a silent, protective gesture. "She is not yours, Graves," Eli said, his voice a low growl. Graves laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Is that so? I have a contract, signed by her father, a legal, binding document. She is mine, by law." He took a step forward. "Come home, Clara. We will forget this unfortunate adventure. I am a forgiving man." "I am not going anywhere with you," Clara said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. She stepped out from behind Eli, to stand beside him. "I am not yours. I will never be yours." Graves's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. His eyes narrowed. "You have made your choice. Then, you choose this broken thing over a life of comfort and respect." He looked from Clara's defiant face to Eli's granite-hard expression. "Very well. There are other ways to settle this. Legal ways, and ways the law doesn't see." He turned on his heel and strode out of the store, his men following close behind, leaving a thick, poisonous silence in his wake. That night, the threat became a reality. Eli had gone to meet with Miguel, to see if any of the other small ranchers, men who had long been squeezed and threatened by Graves's growing power, would be willing to stand with them. Clara was alone in the loft, mending a tear in her skirt by the light of a single lantern. The attack was sudden and swift. The door to the loft burst open and two men, the same two who had been with Graves in the store, lunged in. She had no time to scream. One man clamped a foul-smelling hand over her mouth, while the other bound her wrists with a rough rope. They were brutally efficient, their movements practiced. They threw a sack over her head, plunging her into a terrifying, suffocating darkness, and hauled her out of the livery, her struggles useless against their brute strength. When Eli returned minutes later, the loft was empty. The lantern was overturned, its oil pooling on the floorboards. Clara's sewing basket lay on its side, a spool of thread unwound like a broken promise. A low, guttural sound tore itself from Eli's throat, the sound of an animal whose mate has been stolen from the den. A primal, killing rage, cold and pure, settled over him. He found Miguel in the forge, his face a grim mask of fury. "He has her!" Miguel slammed his hammer down on the anvil, the ringing clang a cry of pure frustration. "That son of a bitch!" "I'm going to get her back," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You can't go alone. Eli, his ranch is a fortress. He'll have a dozen men there." "Then I'll go through a dozen men." "No," Miguel said, his dark eyes flashing. "You won't be alone." He turned and strode out into the night, and Eli followed. They went first to the bunkhouse of a small, neighboring ranch, and then to another. Miguel spoke in low, urgent tones to the ranch hands, men with sun-beaten faces and calloused hands, men who knew Eli's story, who remembered the hero he had been, and who had felt the heel of Carlton Graves's boot on their own necks for too long. A few shook their heads, their fear outweighing their anger, but 5 men, their faces set with a grim resolve, took their rifles from the racks and nodded. It wasn't an army, but it was enough. The raid on Graves's ranch was a chaotic, brutal affair. They stormed the main house under the cover of darkness, the element of surprise their only true advantage. The night exploded in a cacophony of violence. The splintering of wood as the door was kicked in, the grunt of men, the deafening roar of a shotgun, the sharp crack of rifles. Eli moved through the fight like a specter of death, his face a cold, emotionless mask. his movements economical and deadly. The years of war, the years of solitary hunting, had honed him into a perfect instrument of violence. He was not fighting for a cause or a flag. He was fighting for Clara. He found her in Graves's opulent study, tied to a chair. Graves stood over her, a pistol in his hand, a look of smug triumph on his face. When he saw Eli, his expression twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. "I told you I would have what is mine," Graves spat. "Let her go," Eli said, his revolver steady in his hand. Graves laughed and pressed the muzzle of his pistol to Clara's temple. "Drop the gun, soldier, or she dies now." Eli's eyes met Clara's. He saw the terror there, but he also saw an unwavering trust. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his gun and let it fall to the floor. As soon as it clattered on the polished wood, Graves' men swarmed him, disarming him and slamming him to his knees. Graves crossed the room and hit Eli across the face with the butt of his pistol. A vicious, splitting blow. Eli's head snapped back, but he didn't make a sound. "You see, my dear," Graves said to Clara, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is your hero, a pathetic, broken man. Now, you will learn your lesson." He turned back to Eli. "I'm not going to kill you, soldier. I'm going to break you. I'm going to beat you until she begs me to stop." He tossed his pistol aside and lunged at Eli. The fight that followed was not a duel of skill, but a brawl of raw, hateful strength. Graves was a big man, strong and well-fed, but Eli was forged from harder steel. They crashed through the expensive furniture, their fists landing with sickening, meaty thuds. It was a brutal, slogging, desperate struggle. Eli took a savage beating, his body screaming in protest. But he fought on, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than any pain. Graves, enraged that his opponent refused to fall, grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it in a vicious arc. Eli took the blow on his forearm, a sharp crack echoing through the room as the bone broke. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in his arm, but he gritted his teeth and drove his shoulder into Graves's midsection, sending them both crashing through a small writing desk in the splintered wreckage. Eli's hand closed around a thick, jagged piece of a broken chair leg. As Graves rose over him, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer. Eli swung the makeshift club with the last of his strength, connecting with the side of Graves's head. Graves's eyes went wide with surprise, and then he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence descended on the room, broken only by Eli's ragged, gasping breaths. He tried to push himself up, but his body gave out, and he collapsed, a broken heap on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of the fight. Clara, who had managed to free her hands from the ropes during the struggle, rushed to his side. She cradled his head in her lap, her tears falling freely onto his bloodied and bruised face. He was a ruin, his body a testament to the brutal cost of her freedom. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. His face was a swollen mask of cuts and bruises, and his breathing was shallow. But he was alive. He had fought for her. He had not stopped. He opened his eyes, a flicker of consciousness in a sea of pain, and looked up at her. A profound love, fierce and tender, washed over her, eclipsing the horror, the fear, and the pain. Her voice, when she spoke, was miraculously steady through her tears, a vow whispered in the bloody aftermath of the battle. "You didn't stop," she said, her hand gently stroking his battered cheek. "So I won't." The world returned to Eli in fragments of pain and light. For days, he drifted in a gray, fevered haze, anchored to consciousness only by the cool touch of a cloth on his forehead and a soft, steady voice that spoke his name like a prayer. He was back in the loft above Miguel's stables, lying on a clean cot, the sweet scent of hay, a gentle balm against the metallic tang of blood, an antiseptic that clung to him. His body was a map of agony. His left arm, crudely set by the town's weary doctor and bound tight in splints, throbbed with a relentless, fiery pulse. His ribs screamed with every breath, and his face felt like a stranger's, a swollen, tender mask. Through it all, Clara was a constant, unwavering presence. She did not leave his side. She slept on a pallet on the floor next to his cot, her sleep light and fitful, waking at his slightest stir or moan. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips, washed the blood and grime from his skin with a tenderness that bordered on reverence, and changed his bandages with hands that were miraculously steady. She had made a promise over his broken body. "I won't stop," and she lived it in every quiet, devoted action. Miguel would come and go, bringing food, clean linens, and news from the town, his face a mixture of grim concern and profound respect. The other men who had fought with them would stop by, their hats in their hands, their gazes averted but filled with a new, hard-won admiration for the broken man on the cot. Clara was the gatekeeper, the guardian of his recovery. The town of Redemption was a hive of buzzing speculation. Sheriff Miller, a man who preferred the path of least resistance, had arrived at Graves's ranch to find a scene of utter chaos, a half-dozen bruised and battered ranch hands, an unconscious Carlton Graves, and a study that looked as if a tornado had passed through it. Graves, upon waking, had demanded Eli's arrest for assault, trespassing, and a litany of other charges. But the story had already taken root in the town's imagination, and it was not the one Graves wanted told. The men who had fought alongside Eli, their loyalty absolute, told their version of the events. A brave rescue, a fight for a woman's honor against a tyrant who believed he could buy and sell people like cattle. Clara, her voice clear and unwavering, gave her own testimony to the sheriff, detailing her flight from an arranged marriage and her subsequent abduction. The town, which had so recently scorned them, began to see them in a new light. They were not a scandal. They were a story of defiance, of loyalty, of a love that had refused to be broken. Sheriff Miller, caught between the power of Graves's money and the shifting tide of public opinion, did what he did best: nothing. He declared the matter a private dispute, a messy affair in which both sides were at fault, and refused to press charges against anyone. It was a coward's justice, but it was enough. Carlton Graves, his face bruised and his public standing in tatters, saw that he had lost. He had lost Clara. He had lost the respect of the town, and he had lost the illusion of his own invincibility. A week after the fight, under the cover of darkness, he packed his belongings and fled the territory, a disgraced baron abandoning his crumbling kingdom. They had won, but their victory was not in Graves's departure. It was in the small, quiet moments that followed. It was in the way the general store owner now greeted them with a respectful nod. It was in the way the women who had once shunned Clara now offered her small, hesitant smiles. It was in the way men looked at Eli's scarred face, not with mockery, but with a kind of awe. They had faced down the biggest man in the territory and had not backed down. They had earned something far more valuable than acceptance. They had earned respect. As the weeks passed, Eli's body began to heal. The fever broke, the swelling in his face subsided, and the raw agony in his arm settled into a dull, persistent ache. But as his physical strength returned, the old ghosts began to creep back into the quiet corners of his mind. He would lie awake at night, long after Clara had fallen into an exhausted sleep, and stare up at the shadowed rafters of the loft. He had won the fight, but he felt no triumph. The violence he had unleashed, the cold, killing rage that had taken him over, had terrified him. It was a part of himself he had tried to bury in the mountains, a beast he had thought long dead. He had brought it back to life for Clara, but he feared it was all he had to offer her. He was a man of violence and scars, a man with nothing to his name but a rifle and a past full of regret. What kind of a life could he give her? He looked at her sleeping face in the moonlight, at the peaceful innocence that had somehow survived everything she had endured. and a profound sense of unworthiness washed over him. He did not deserve this peace. He did not deserve her. Clara sensed his retreat. She felt him pulling away, rebuilding the walls around his heart that she had so carefully dismantled. He was quieter, his eyes once again holding that distant, haunted look she knew so well. She knew that the end of one battle was simply the beginning of another, a quieter but no less difficult struggle for the peace they had both earned. One afternoon, when he was finally strong enough to sit in a chair by the open loft door, soaking in the warm sun, she came to him with a proposal. Miguel had offered them a small piece of his land, a few acres on the edge of his property that bordered the open plains, a place with a clear view of the mountains they had left behind. "We could stay here, Eli," she said, her voice soft but full of a conviction that belied its quietness. "We could build a cabin, a small one, just for us." He looked out at the endless expanse of the prairie, at the distant, hazy blue of the mountains that had been both his sanctuary and his prison. The thought of building something new, of putting down roots, was both terrifying and intoxicatingly beautiful. But the ghosts were loud in his ears. "I'm not a builder, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "I'm a destroyer. Everything I've ever tried to build has turned to ash." He thought of the burning farmhouse, of Anna's face, of his own smoldering cabin. "That's not true," she insisted gently. "You built a life for yourself in the woods. You built a safe place for me. You are the strongest man I have ever known." "What you see as strength is just scar tissue," he said, a bitter edge to his voice. He looked down at his own hands, one of them still wrapped in linen. "These hands, they know how to break things. That's all." Clara said nothing more. She simply left his side and returned a few moments later with a piece of charcoal and a clean, smooth piece of wood she had scavenged. She sat on the floor at his feet and began to draw. He watched her, his curiosity piqued. Her hand moved with a surprising confidence, the charcoal whispering across the surface of the wood. She worked for nearly an hour, her face a study in deep concentration. When she was finished, she held it up for him to see. It was a sketch, simple but rendered with a startling clarity and emotion. It was a picture of a small, sturdy log cabin. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. In front of the cabin stood two figures. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a familiar scar on his cheek, his arm resting protectively around the shoulders of a woman who leaned into him, her face turned up to his with a look of pure, unadulterated love. In the distance, two horses grazed peacefully on an open plain, and beyond them, the jagged, beautiful peaks of the mountains rose up to meet a wide-open sky. Eli stared at the drawing, his breath catching in his throat. It was a vision of a life he had never dared to imagine for himself, a life of peace, of warmth, of home. It was everything he had ever wanted and everything he believed he could never have. "This is what I ran for," Clara said, her voice quiet but ringing with a profound truth. "Not just away from him, but toward this. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. This is all I have ever wanted." He looked from the drawing to her face, at the fierce, unwavering hope in her eyes, and for the first time, he allowed a tiny, fragile seed of that same hope to take root in his own wounded soul. A week later, they walked out to the piece of land Miguel had given them. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The wind, that constant, restless voice of the prairie, blew around them, carrying the scent of sweetgrass and distant rain. They stood on a small rise, looking out at the land that was now theirs. It was empty, wild, and full of a terrifying and beautiful promise. Eli turned to her, the dying light catching in her hair, turning it to spun gold. The sketch she had drawn was tucked safely in his shirt pocket, resting against his heart. The ghosts were still there, whispering their litany of his failures, of his unworthiness. He had to ask. He had to know. "Are you sure, Clara?" he asked, his voice raw with all the emotion he could not express. "Are you sure this is what you want, to stay here, with me? After everything, all the pain I've brought into your life." She stepped closer to him, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. She reached up and placed her hand on his scarred cheek, her touch as gentle as a benediction. She looked deep into his eyes, into the stormy, troubled soul of the man she loved. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and fierce, a whisper that held the strength of an unbreakable vow. "Only if you don't stop." He understood. Don't stop trying. Don't stop healing. Don't stop fighting the ghosts. Don't stop believing in the life they could build together. Don't stop loving her. A slow smile, the first genuine, untroubled smile he had felt in years, spread across his face. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was not about passion or hunger, but about promise. It was a kiss that tasted of hope, of forgiveness, and of the beginning of a future he was finally ready to claim. They stood there for a long time, holding each other as the sun sank below the horizon, casting their two long shadows across the empty plain. The last image was of them turning, two small figures walking side by side, into the wind, toward that piece of land, that small patch of earth that might, after a lifetime of running, just be home. Though they were scarred by fire, by loss, and by violence, their love had not only survived, but had been made stronger, purer, by all that it had endured. The silence between them was no longer one of pain or mistrust, but a deep, comfortable quiet that finally spoke everything that ever needed to be said. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the American West. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.